year was 1944. Across the fields of northern France, the wind carried the low hum of distant engines and the faint echo of laughter. Through the lenses of their binoculars, German reconnaissance officers watched with smug amusement as something peculiar unfolded in the valley below. A line of American Sherman tanks stood perfectly still under the afternoon sun. An entire armored column frozen like statues. Their shapes were correct, their shadows crisp, yet something about them looked off. One officer tilted his head, chuckled, and said, "The Americans must be desperate. Their tanks don't even leave tracks." Another joined in the laughter. From their vantage point, the scene looked ridiculous. A ghost army of motionless machines that didn't rumble, didn't smoke, didn't even glint with the oily shine of metal. It was as if the Americans had forgotten what real war looked like. The Germans radioed their observation back to command, confident in their discovery. Enemy armor sighted near the village, immobile, likely damaged or abandoned. The message traveled quickly up the chain, confirming what many in the Wehrmacht already believed. The Americans were inexperienced, untested, and sloppy. For the German officers who had survived years of hard battle across Europe, the sight of these tanks was almost comical. They laughed at the absurdity, unaware that the laughter itself was part of the trap. At that same moment, a few miles away, a group of young American soldiers crouched behind the tree line, stifling their own nervous laughter. Their uniforms were smudged with dirt, but not from combat, from mud used to anchor inflatable tanks into the ground. They held not rifles, but air pumps and ropes. The tanks the Germans were mocking were nothing more than balloons, massive rubber replicas that could be lifted by 6 men and inflated in 20 minutes. Under the trees sat a truck filled with sound equipment and reels of pre-recorded tank engines. The men working there weren't typical soldiers. They were artists, engineers, architects, hand-picked from art schools and advertising agencies back home. Their mission was unlike anything else in the war: to deceive, to confuse, and to mislead. The idea had been born months earlier in the quiet offices of Allied intelligence in London. As plans for the invasion of Europe took shape, one truth became clear. The Germans' greatest strength wasn't just their weaponry, but their ability to read the battlefield. Their reconnaissance was relentless, their analysts precise, and their spies quick to notice any buildup of troops. The Allies needed to trick them, not once, but repeatedly. They needed to make the Germans believe that armies existed where there were none, and that silence hid only weakness. To do that, they would use imagination as a weapon. The unit that emerged was officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Unofficially, they called themselves the Ghost Army. They were painters from New York, sound designers from Hollywood, and set builders from Broadway. When other soldiers were trained to destroy, these men were trained to create illusions. They were armed with paintbrushes, loudspeakers, and air compressors. Their battlefield would not be one of bullets and trenches. It would be one of shadows and light. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for their decisive strike in Western Europe, the Ghost Army was dispatched to the front lines with orders so strange that many thought it was a joke. They were to create a fake division, thousands of men who didn't exist. Using inflatable tanks, rubber trucks, and wooden artillery, they were to convince German intelligence that the Allies were amassing a massive force in one region, when in truth the real invasion was taking place elsewhere. The plan depended on every detail. From above, the fake tanks had to cast the right shadows. Their positions had to match genuine battle formations. They had to leave convincing tracks in the dirt, so men would drag heavy chains behind jeeps to imitate tire marks. Laundry would be hung between tents to suggest the presence of thousands of troops. Mess areas were set up, fires lit, and fake radio chatter filled the air. The Ghost Army even staged fake traffic jams to make the illusion complete, and from a distance, it worked. The Germans watched, confused but intrigued, as new divisions appeared overnight. The Allied deception teams were playing a dangerous game, one that could collapse the moment a German patrol ventured too close. Every man in the Ghost Army knew that if their secret were discovered, they'd be slaughtered. None of them carried heavy weapons. Their mission depended entirely on the belief that what they built looked real enough to be feared. In the villages nearby, French civilians often saw the soldiers inflating tanks in open fields. Children would stare in disbelief as rubber monsters rose from the grass, their forms taking shape in the early morning fog. To them, it looked like magic. One of the soldiers, sketching the scene in his notebook, wrote, "We're fighting a war made of air and paint, and somehow it's working." By the spring of that year, the German High Command began to shift forces based on these illusions. Entire divisions moved to counter phantom armies. Roads were mined, bridges destroyed, and artillery repositioned, all aimed at targets that didn't exist. The Germans' meticulous intelligence was turning against them. Every fake tank, every recorded engine sound, every false radio signal fed into their overconfidence. But not everyone on the German side was convinced. A few officers grew uneasy. Reports began to contradict one another. Some claimed there were hundreds of tanks, while others swore there were none. A reconnaissance pilot photographed the fields again and noticed something odd. In the morning, the tanks faced east. By evening, they faced west. He filed a report saying, "Either the Americans have developed tanks that turn with the sun, or something is very wrong." Still, the laughter continued. From afar, the Germans believed they were witnessing yet another example of Allied incompetence. "Rubber tanks?" one colonel scoffed during a briefing. "Typical American showmanship." His men chuckled, confident that such foolishness would never win a war. But in secret Allied command rooms, officers smiled for another reason. The laughter of the enemy meant the deception was working. For every German unit diverted to chase a phantom army, a real Allied force advanced elsewhere with less resistance. Every joke the Germans made about America's toy tanks brought the Allies closer to victory. As night fell over the French countryside, the fields filled with whispers and the faint hiss of air compressors. One by one, the rubber giants came alive under the moonlight. To a watching enemy, they looked like the promise of destruction. To the men who built them, they were fragile shields, thin walls of air standing between thousands of real soldiers and certain death. Somewhere in the dark, a German officer adjusted his binoculars and frowned. Something about the stillness of the valley made him uneasy. He watched one of the American tanks, its turret glinting faintly in the moonlight, and muttered, "They can't all be empty." He was right. But by the time he understood what he was truly seeing, the trap had already been set. The German officer lowered his binoculars, his expression turning from amusement to mild suspicion. The line of American tanks in the valley hadn't moved all day, but something about their arrangement, too perfect, too clean, kept tugging at his instincts. Still, he brushed the thought aside. The report had already gone up the chain of command, and the laughter had already echoed through the mess hall that evening. "Americans and their Hollywood tricks," one captain said between bites of bread. "They can't fight without making a show of it." Yet far from that dinner table, in the damp fields of northern France, the men behind those Hollywood tricks were fighting a different kind of war, one that didn't rely on bullets or blood, but on deception, timing, and nerves of steel. Just beyond the German observation line, behind a patch of trees near the river, Corporal Alan Hart wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned against what looked like a steel tank tread. Except it wasn't steel. It was painted rubber. The sun was beating down, and the air compressor hissed beside him as a Sherman tank slowly came to life, its rubber sides puffing outward like a balloon animal. The other men watched, tense and focused. "You think they're buying it?" one whispered. Alan chuckled, his voice tired but steady. "If they're laughing, it means they haven't figured it out." and that's good enough for me." The men of the Ghost Army had grown used to this strange rhythm: inflate, paint, position, vanish. They moved like magicians setting up tricks, each operation lasting only a few days before they disappeared again into the countryside. The rules were simple: never stay long enough to be found, never make the illusion too still, and never forget that the enemy might be watching every move. When the compressors fell silent, the field was suddenly filled with 20 gleaming tanks, all perfectly aligned, their shadows stretching across the grass. A small cheer went up, quickly stifled. The sound team, huddled in the back of a truck, began to play loops of engine noise, recordings of real Sherman battalions idling and revving. The low mechanical growl drifted through the valley, mixing with the chirp of insects and the distant boom of real artillery. From the air, it would look like another massive American division preparing to strike. Hours later, as dusk fell, the men built fake supply depots using wooden crates filled with nothing but air. They hung laundry lines between tents, drove jeeps in tight circles to create tire marks, and placed mannequins near campfires to mimic off-duty soldiers. To anyone spying from afar, it looked like life, chaotic, noisy, and human. But beneath it all was silence, the kind that only men who knew their lives depended on secrecy could maintain. Every sound had to be deliberate, every movement calculated. Alan lit a cigarette and stared at the horizon. The war had taught him to measure time by missions, not days. He had joined the unit thinking it was a joke, an artist drafted to paint camouflage nets and road signs. Now he was standing in the middle of a battlefield made of rubber and sound. "You know," said his friend, Private Lewis, crouching beside him, "if the Germans ever find out we're just a bunch of painters and sound guys, they'll shoot us before they ask questions." Alan exhaled smoke, his eyes hardening. "Then we'd better make sure they never do." That night, the fake tanks gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere far above, a German reconnaissance plane buzzed through the clouds, its pilot scanning the ground below. The report he filed hours later would confirm it. American armor massing near the Seine River. The illusion was complete. Within a day, German divisions began moving to intercept what they believed was a major Allied attack. But the real American divisions were hundreds of miles away, preparing for the actual breakthrough elsewhere. The laughter of the German officers had led them straight into a miscalculation. As the first rays of dawn painted the valley in gold, the Ghost Army began dismantling their setup. The men worked fast, deflating tanks, rolling up rubber sheets, and loading them onto trucks. They left only footprints, cigarette butts, and a few stray ropes behind. Within hours, the entire camp had vanished. When German patrols eventually reached the area, they found nothing. No tanks, no soldiers, only flattened patches of grass. Confusion spread quickly. "They must have moved overnight," a sergeant concluded. "We'll find them again." But they wouldn't. The Americans were already setting up the next illusion miles away. By mid-morning, the Ghost Army had relocated to another site. The operation was codenamed Viersen. Their orders were to draw German attention away from the Ninth Army's real crossing point over the Rhine. They worked through rain and mud, inflating more than 100 tanks and trucks, setting up dummy artillery positions and broadcasting fake radio chatter. Sound engineers played hours of recordings of pontoon bridges being built, while others sent out messages using call signs of divisions that didn't exist. The deception was layered and relentless. If the Germans had been skeptical before, the scale of this illusion erased any doubt. In a farmhouse nearby, an elderly French woman watched them from her window, her eyes wide. She had seen many strange things since the occupation began, but this, men carrying deflated tanks on their shoulders, pumping air into them until they towered overhead, seemed like madness. "Les fous," she whispered to her grandson. "The crazy ones." But when American soldiers offered her chocolate and cigarettes in exchange for silence, She nodded solemnly. "I will not speak." She didn't understand the plan, but she understood its purpose. That evening, German scouts advanced toward the decoy position, cautiously approaching through the trees. Through their binoculars, they saw what appeared to be hundreds of Allied vehicles and heavy guns. A report was filed, and artillery batteries were ordered to open fire. Shells screamed across the valley, exploding in bright flashes, tearing holes not in steel, but in fabric. Rubber tanks burst like balloons, flapping uselessly in the wind. And yet, to the German command, it looked like a victory. They believed they had destroyed an advancing American column. Meanwhile, the real U.S. forces crossed the Rhine almost unopposed, catching the Germans completely off guard. By nightfall, the deception unit retreated again, packing what little remained. The smell of burnt rubber lingered in the air. A few soldiers joked about sending thank-you notes to the Germans for wasting their ammunition. But beneath the humor was exhaustion. They knew how fragile their safety was. Each time they staged an operation, they risked being discovered. The Germans had already started sending patrols deeper into suspected decoy zones. One slip, one stray word over the radio, one soldier caught inflating a tank at the wrong time, and the entire ghost army would vanish in a blaze of gunfire. Allen and his men huddled by a small fire, the flames flickering against the dark canvas of a deflated tank beside them. "You ever think about what happens if they find out?" Lewis asked quietly. Allen stared into the fire. "Yeah, every time we start pumping air." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of real tanks somewhere to the north filled the silence. Then Allen added, "But if they're aiming at us, that means they're not aiming at the guys who have to fight for real. I can live with that." Far behind them, in the German command headquarters, the confusion was spreading. Reports from reconnaissance units contradicted field observations. Some claimed to have destroyed entire divisions, while others insisted the same divisions were spotted days later in different locations. Maps were redrawn again and again. Officers argued over which direction the main American assault would come from. What none of them realized was that the chaos they were drowning in was the result of a handful of men armed with air pumps and imagination. By late spring, the Ghost Army's reputation, though still secret, had grown within Allied circles. Commanders began to rely on their tricks to protect real operations. They could create the illusion of strength or conceal weakness. In one instance, they even used inflatable artillery to draw fire away from genuine units pinned down by enemy guns. Every time, the pattern repeated: disbelief, laughter, realization, and defeat. For the men themselves, though, there was little glory. Their work was classified. They weren't allowed to write home about what they did, not even to their families. When the war ended, they would fade quietly into civilian life, their contribution hidden for decades. But for now, and in 1944, their strange secret war continued. The next morning, Allen stood at the edge of the field as fog rolled across the valley. The tanks were gone again, packed tightly in trucks, leaving nothing behind but damp earth. He listened to the hum of engines as the convoy moved out, heading toward their next destination. "Another ghost town," Lewis said from the passenger seat. Allen smiled faintly. "Yeah, another one." Behind them, the Germans returned to the same field, expecting to find wreckage from their previous bombardment. Instead, they found emptiness. No twisted metal, no corpses, only grass bent where something heavy had once stood. "Impossible," one officer muttered. "They can't have moved all this overnight." He kicked at a half-buried fragment of rubber, but it told him nothing. His men searched the area for hours, finding only faint tracks that led nowhere. Somewhere deep inside, a chill crept into his thoughts. The laughter from earlier days began to fade. He looked out over the silent valley, the morning light glinting on dew-soaked grass. The Americans, it seemed, had disappeared into thin air. And though he didn't know it yet, what he had witnessed was the beginning of one of the most effective deceptions in modern warfare, a battle won not with tanks or bullets, but with shadows, sound, and a handful of men who turned imagination into a weapon. The German officer returned to headquarters that afternoon, still shaking his head. The valley was empty. Not a tank tread, not a burnt-out vehicle, not even a discarded helmet. He placed the rubber fragment he had found on the table in front of his superior, a strange piece of evidence that seemed to mock them. The colonel picked it up, frowned, and muttered, "What kind of armor bends like this?" They both stared at it, neither man able to explain how an entire division could vanish without a trace. But across the front lines, the Americans were already setting up their next stage, and for the Ghost Army, it was just another day of work. Their trucks rumbled down muddy back roads, loaded with deflated tanks, fake artillery, and bundles of wooden planks that would soon become bridges. Inside the convoy, the men sat shoulder to shoulder, tired but alert, the smell of diesel mixed with the faint scent of rubber and sweat. Corporal Alan Hart leaned against the side of his truck, sketchbook balanced on his knees, pencil moving in quick strokes as he drew the countryside passing by. He was trying to capture the faces of his comrades, Lewis smoking quietly, Sergeant Burke staring out the window, the radio operator humming an old jazz tune under his breath. These weren't the faces of killers or conquerors. They were artists, designers, ad men, and sound engineers thrown into the strangest war imaginable. Some had built billboards in Times Square, others had mixed sound for Broadway shows. Now they were faking armies. When the convoy reached a small French village near the Meuse River, they stopped under the cover of trees. Orders were short and clear: create the illusion of an armored division preparing to cross the river by morning. Alan and Lewis unloaded the first set of tanks, dragging the folded rubber carcasses through the mud. Air compressors coughed to life, and the shapes began to rise, hissing and trembling. Within an hour, the meadow beside the river was transformed into a miniature battlefield, rows of tanks, trucks, and artillery, all gleaming under the fading sun. The sound crew rolled their heavy speakers into position and connected them to a generator. When the switch was thrown, the air filled with the low rumble of engines, the metallic clank of treads, and the shouts of soldiers that weren't there. The effect was eerie. Even standing beside the speakers, the men felt as if they were surrounded by hundreds of invisible troops. At night, they added more details: campfires flickering, flashlights moving through the darkness, voices calling orders. From the opposite side of the river, any observer would swear an entire division was massed and ready to move. It was a strange kind of power, Alan thought as he sat by the riverbank, watching the reflections of the fake tanks shimmer in the water. They were creating fear out of thin air. He wondered if somewhere out there, a German reconnaissance team was watching through binoculars, scribbling frantic notes and radioing back their discoveries. The idea made him grin. "You think they're buying it?" Lewis asked, lying beside him. "They have to," Alan replied. "We're the best actors in this war." But it wasn't all laughter. Each operation came with risk. One wrong move, and the Germans would realize the deception. A few weeks earlier, during a similar mission, a patrol had stumbled too close to a Ghost Army camp. The men had barely escaped, leaving behind a few half-inflated tanks. The Germans had shelled the area for hours, certain they'd destroyed a major force. Now, every man knew what discovery could mean. There were no rifles, no artillery, and no real armor to hide behind. If the enemy attacked, they had only their trucks and their luck. The morning came with heavy fog. Across the river, faint outlines of movement appeared. German troops adjusting positions, preparing for battle. Their intelligence had done its job. The enemy believed an American offensive was imminent. As shells began to fall on the far bank, Alan's unit received new orders: pack up and vanish before daylight revealed the truth. They worked quickly, deflating tanks, rolling them into bundles, and loading the sound equipment back onto trucks. By the time the fog lifted, they were gone. All that remained were tire marks and a few scraps of fabric fluttering in the grass. Later that day, in another part of France, the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine almost unopposed. The Germans had moved their defenses in the wrong direction, following the ghosts. For the men who had pulled the strings, it was another quiet victory, one they couldn't celebrate publicly or even talk about. But inside the truck, as the convoy rolled away from the river, someone started humming Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. And soon everyone joined in, laughing at the absurdity of fighting a war with balloons and speakers. By mid-1944, their operations had become more daring. They created entire phantom corps, complete with fake headquarters, signal companies, and motor pools. Painters designed insignias for imaginary divisions, and radio men sent hours of fake transmissions to reinforce the illusion. Every detail mattered, even the way a tent faced could give away a lie. When they staged a fake camp, they arranged mess areas, ammunition dumps, and repair stations exactly as a real army would. The deception wasn't just visual, it was psychological. They studied how the Germans thought, what kind of patterns they looked for, and then gave them exactly that. The sound engineers played a crucial role. Using massive speakers mounted on trucks, they broadcast loops of recorded battles, tanks rumbling over bridges, and infantry chatter. The equipment could project sound up to 15 miles away. One night, Alan stood near a speaker as the recordings played. The ground vibrated under his boots, and for a moment, he forgot it was all fake. "Feels real, doesn't it?" Sergeant Burke said beside him. "That's the idea," Alan replied. They had begun calling themselves the Artists of War. Yet beneath the jokes, there was a quiet tension. None of them were supposed to be there long, and yet each new success brought new missions. The stakes grew higher with each deception. Word had reached them that Hitler's intelligence units were beginning to take special interest in the mysterious moving divisions appearing and disappearing across France. German code breakers were baffled. Some even speculated the Allies had developed new technology, machines that could vanish or duplicate themselves. The truth was far simpler and far more human. One evening, while setting up near the outskirts of a ruined village, Alan and Lewis were joined by a group of British officers who had come to observe the Ghost Army in action. The British had their own history with deception, having staged elaborate fake invasions earlier in the war, but even they were impressed. "You Yanks," one officer said with a grin, "you don't just fight wars, you produce them." Alan laughed. "We like to give the enemy a good show." The operation that followed was one of their boldest. They set up less than 5 miles from a real front line within artillery range. The risk was enormous, but the payoff could be decisive. The Germans believed they were facing 2 armored divisions, not 1. Reinforcements were pulled from other sectors, weakening their defense where the real Allied attack would strike days later. Every time the Ghost Army succeeded, real soldiers survived. That was what kept them going, the knowledge that their lies were saving lives. Still, the strain showed. Nights were long, nerves frayed, and the fear of discovery hung over every mission. One night, a shell landed dangerously close, shaking the ground and tearing through one of the inflated tanks. It deflated with a hiss, collapsing in on itself like a dying creature. Alan and Lewis dove for cover, dirt raining down around them. "Guess that one's out of commission," Lewis muttered, trying to laugh. Alan's hands trembled as he reached for his helmet. "If they start firing again, we're dead," he said quietly. They lay there for what felt like hours until the barrage stopped. When morning came, the tanks were patched, the sound trucks repositioned, and the show went on as if nothing had happened. In their rare moments of rest, the men talked about what they would do after the war. Some dreamed of going back to art school, others of opening design studios, but all of them knew they could never fully explain what they'd done. "Who's going to believe us?" Alan joked once. "Hey Ma, I won the war with a rubber tank." The others laughed, but the silence that followed was heavy. They all understood that history would remember the heroes with guns, not the ones with air pumps. Yet as the summer wore on, their work continued to shape the battlefield. Every fake formation, every illusion drew German forces farther from where the real fighting was happening. The Allies advanced steadily, and by the time the German command realized how deeply they'd been fooled, it was too late. The laughter that had once filled their briefing rooms had turned into anger and disbelief. Reports circulated about phantom divisions, about invisible armies that appeared overnight and vanished by dawn. The Germans began to fear shadows. For Alan, the war had become a blur of movement, fields, towns, rivers, faces he barely remembered. But he never forgot the first time he saw the Germans retreating from a position they had been tricked into defending. The thought that their imagination had forced an army to move felt unreal. It was as if art itself had become a weapon, more powerful than bullets. By autumn, the men were exhausted but proud. They had played their part in shaping one of the most successful deception campaigns in history. And though the Germans still didn't know it, the war they thought they were fighting was, in part, an illusion crafted by a handful of ordinary men with extraordinary creativity. As their convoy moved out once more under the cold October sky, Alan looked out the window and watched the mist roll over the fields. Somewhere out there, German soldiers were staring through their binoculars again, trying to make sense of the American armor that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. He smiled faintly and muttered to himself, "Keep laughing, boys. That's how we know it's working." The mist clung to the fields like a thin blanket as the convoy rolled deeper into France. The trucks rattled over uneven roads, their tires kicking up mud and fallen leaves. Inside one of them, Alan rubbed his eyes, trying to stay awake. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days. None of them had. The orders had come fast, another deception mission, one bigger and riskier than any before. It was late 1944 now, and though the Allies were pushing deeper into German territory, the fighting was far from over. Every movement, every deception, still mattered. The Germans were desperate, unpredictable, and watching everything. By dawn, they reached an open plateau surrounded by forest. Sergeant Burke climbed down from his jeep and surveyed the area. "This'll do," he said, lighting a cigarette. "We're going to make them believe there's an entire armored division camped here." The men unloaded quickly, setting up the compressors, unrolling the folded rubber tanks, and arranging the fake artillery. The air soon filled with the familiar hiss of inflation, and by afternoon, what had been an empty field looked like the forward base of a massive American force. Rows of Sherman tanks glistened in the cold light, trucks lined up neatly along the road, and radio towers reached toward the gray sky. The Ghost Army had done this countless times before, but this mission carried a different weight. Their orders were to mislead the Germans into thinking the U.S. Third Army was preparing a major attack in the north. In truth, the real offensive was happening hundreds of miles away. The success of the operation depended entirely on whether the Germans took the bait. Alan and Lewis were assigned to the perimeter, placing dummy fuel drums and setting up fake supply lines. "You ever get the feeling we're part of some big magic trick?" Lewis asked, tossing a rope over a post. Alan smirked. "We are the trick," he replied, "and as long as they keep falling for it, we're doing our job." By evening, the sound team had finished installing their loudspeakers. When they flipped the switches, the field came alive with the noise of engines, shouting soldiers, and the clank of metal. The illusion was so perfect that even the French villagers nearby believed a real division had arrived. Children peeked through fences, waving at the tanks, unaware that what they saw could be folded and packed into a truck within an hour. As night fell, the men gathered around small fires, trying to stay warm. Sergeant Burke went over the plan again. The deception would run for 48 hours, long enough to draw German attention and force them to reposition their forces. The risk was enormous. If enemy scouts got too close, They'd realized the truth. But luck, once again, seemed to be on their side. Across the lines, German reconnaissance planes began to report heavy Allied presence in the area. Commanders grew alarmed. The maps spread across their tables lit up with new markings, lines, arrows, positions that didn't exist. Believing they were facing a massive American buildup, they diverted units from the Ardennes region to the north. In doing so, they thinned the very front that the Allies were preparing to attack for real. The deception worked better than anyone had expected. From their hidden observation post, Alan and his team watched through binoculars as German trucks rumbled down distant roads, moving away from the real battlefield. "Would you look at that?" Lewis whispered. "They're actually falling for it again." Alan nodded, a tired grin spreading across his face. "They always do. They trust their eyes too much." But that night, the illusion nearly collapsed. A German patrol, 5 men, was spotted moving cautiously through the woods toward their position. They'd come to investigate after reports of strange activity. Alan's heart pounded as the sergeant whispered orders. "No one move, no one speak." The fake tanks loomed like sleeping beasts under the moonlight. The Germans drew closer, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. One of them raised a flashlight, its beam sliding across the rubber skin of a Sherman tank. For a terrifying second, Alan thought they'd noticed the seams. But then the sound truck roared to life behind them, blasting the rumble of engines and distant shouting. The patrol froze, startled. Convinced they'd stumbled too close to an armored camp, they turned and vanished into the darkness. The men exhaled in relief. "That was close," Lewis whispered. Alan nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead even in the cold. Too close. By morning, the news came through the radio. The German High Command had officially shifted several armored units north, completely fooled by the Phantom Army. Their analysts believed a major Allied offensive was imminent in the region. Every deception signal had done its work. The fake radio chatter, the staged movements, the sounds, it had all created a picture too convincing to doubt. As the operation wound down, the Ghost Army began to dismantle their illusion once more. The tanks deflated one by one, collapsing into heaps of fabric. The sound faded, the fires went out, and by midday, the field was empty again. The men loaded their equipment in silence. Each of them understood what their work had achieved. By forcing the Germans to react to a battle that didn't exist, they had saved thousands of real soldiers fighting somewhere else. Later that afternoon, Alan sat in the back of the truck, flipping through his sketchbook. Between pages filled with drawings of landscapes and faces, he'd started a series of sketches of their battles, fields full of inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and men pretending to be an army. "You think anyone will ever believe this happened?" Lewis asked from beside him. Alan looked up, thoughtful. "Maybe not," he said. "But history's full of strange things people didn't believe until someone told them twice." Across the front, German morale began to crack. Rumors spread among the troops about ghost divisions, American forces that appeared and vanished, leaving no trace. Some soldiers swore they'd shelled a field full of tanks only to find nothing the next day. Others claimed to have heard armies moving at night that simply disappeared by dawn. The confusion weakened their confidence. They no longer trusted what they saw. Every field, every shadow became suspect. As weeks passed, the Ghost Army continued its work, moving constantly, building and vanishing, each mission more daring than the last. Their greatest success came near the end of the war, when they staged an entire fake crossing of the Rhine River. Thousands of inflatable boats lined the riverbank, fake artillery covered the hills, and recordings of bridge construction echoed across the water. German scouts who reported the activity triggered panic in their command. Units were diverted to defend the crossing that never happened, leaving the real invasion path exposed. When the Allies finally struck the true position, resistance was minimal. The war in Europe was entering its final act, and the Ghost Army had played a crucial, invisible role in shaping its outcome. When victory was finally declared months later, the men celebrated quietly. There were no medals, no public parades. Their work remained classified. Each man returned home carrying memories he couldn't share. Alan went back to his small apartment in New York, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He returned to painting, but his art changed. His canvases were no longer of landscapes or portraits. They were of shadows, illusions, and light. When people asked about his inspiration, he simply said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." For decades, the Ghost Army's story stayed hidden. The men who had tricked one of the most powerful military machines in history faded into ordinary life. Teachers, artists, architects, advertisers. It wasn't until the 1990s that the truth began to surface. Declassified documents revealed what they had done, and interviews with surviving veterans painted a picture of courage unlike any other. They had fought not with bullets, but with creativity. They had turned imagination into a weapon, art into armor, and sound into strategy. Alan, now an old man with silver hair and a weathered face, sat in his studio one afternoon when a journalist came to interview him. She asked, "How did it feel, knowing you fooled the enemy like that?" He smiled faintly and looked out the window. "Strange," he said. "We were kids, really. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just did our job. We made them see what we wanted them to see, and by the time they realized it wasn't real, it didn't matter anymore." The journalist leaned forward. "Did you ever feel guilty?" Alan shook his head. "No, not once. Every time they fired at one of our fake tanks, it meant fewer bullets fired at the real soldiers. We gave them ghosts to chase. I'd call that mercy." Outside, the city traffic roared, but for Alan, it all faded into the hum of compressors and the low thrum of recorded engines. He could almost smell the damp fields of France again, see the rubber tanks glistening under moonlight, and hear the laughter of his friends echoing through the darkness. Those nights had changed him. The fear, the creativity, the absurdity. All of it had taught him something about war and the strange ways people survived it. As he stood to show the journalist one of his paintings, she noticed a small inscription at the corner of the canvas. It read, "To those who fought with air and imagination." In the end, the Germans' laughter had been their undoing. They had mocked what they didn't understand. A silent army of artists who waged war with shadows. The Ghost Army's work had saved thousands of lives and helped end one of history's darkest chapters. And though their tanks were made of rubber and their guns were empty, their courage was real. Alan often said that the greatest victory of his life wasn't tricking the enemy. It was proving that creativity could defeat cruelty, that imagination could be as powerful as any weapon. And as history finally began to remember the men who had fought with air, their story became more than a secret. It became a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength in war is not destruction, but deception done in the name of peace